Hi, this is Chris Dixon. This is the a16z podcast. Today I'm with Benedict Evans and Balaji Srinivasan. Guys, let's talk about there's sort of this recurring idea that in the press, for example, that everyone in Silicon Valley is spending time on trivial things, photo sharing and funny little apps, and not working on serious things. So, Balaji, what do you think about this?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think that's the case. I think to some extent there's a catch-22 where certainly there are people who are working on social games, they're working on social networking, things like that, and that I would argue that some of those things are going to be more important down the line. For example, gaming led to 3D graphics, and it's leading to Oculus. Social networking has led to other services, for example, like Lyft, that are built on top of it that are much less trivial than poking. But even taking those and saying they're maybe more important than people think. Twitter started as breakfast SaaS updates, and now it's used for revolutions and breaking news. So even given that those things are actually not as trivial as people think, the other side of the coin is, while those things are easy to start, there are applications in genomics and drones and Bitcoin and 3D printing and things like that do run into regulatory challenges. And so some of the reason that people see these things that are perceived as fluff that get big fast is that it is non-trivial to build a business in these other areas. So there's, I think, a regulatory barriers there as well.
I would argue that a lot of this is also the media, just sort of what's it's a function of the way media covers Silicon Valley. So it's, if you look at, for example, so we, as our firm, we were investors in Instagram. We were also investors in Nicera. Both those companies sold around the same point actually Nicera sold for more. I think it was $1.4 billion. Instagram, depending on Facebook stock price, of $702 billion. But if you go and do a Google News search, there were literally 100 to 1 articles about Instagram versus Nicera. Now, Instagram's an amazing company. They deserve the coverage. But the point is, the press doesn't really want to talk about software-defined networking. And so, which is understandable. Like, people don't want to read that. That's fine. But don't then extrapolate from media coverage that that's actually what's going on in Silicon Valley. So, for example, 70% of all venture capital goes into enterprise companies, which, more than half of which are infrastructure. So it's very hard to argue just when you have the raw data that 30 to 40% of investment is in infrastructure, that we aren't doing infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to split out what is easy for a journalist to write about and what is going to sell newspapers, what's going to sit well to a general audience. Talking about consumer products is a lot easier than talking about B2B products. B2B products tend to be in the business page and consumer products tend to be in the news pages. And talking about 22-year-olds who sell their product for $1 gazillion kind of needs to be on the front page because that's newsworthy. So... But
fine, that's fine. That's fine, but then don't extrapolate.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the second-order articles I object to, not the first-order, right? The second order, they then extrapolate from that and say that's all that's happening. Like, wait a second,
Yeah, I think that's the thing that it's if you are not immersed in the kind of the hardcore technology or the hardcore computer science or the infrastructure building that's getting done, you can't see it. You can see that.
But you've seen it, like just being here, for example.
Yeah,
that,
exactly.
70% of the time, we're talking about fixing healthcare, fixing finance, fixing better semiconductors, better data centers. This is what most people are doing here. Right?
Yeah, I think that's true. But if you're trying to write, it's easy to write about phenomena and to try and construct phenomena. And, there's no question that compared to, 10 years ago, there were a lot of people creating companies with silly names that did things that didn't appear to be terribly important. And that masked a lot of the interesting stuff. Today, there's a lot of 22-year-olds creating companies that get lots of users and get interesting, sexy valuations that appear to be doing stuff that isn't very interesting or isn't very exciting. And so you can write about that. The fact that there's a lot more 30-year-olds or indeed 22-year-olds creating companies like Box or creating, Nicera, all these other, more profound, more fundamental businesses, just doesn't get covered. So I think, in a sense, every industry hates the press. Every industry thinks the press doesn't write about us the way it should write about us, and they focus on the trivial stuff, and they focus on the stuff that sells in newspapers, and it's always true.
I would offer one other thing, which is basically it is certainly true that they call it the media because it mediates our interpretation of reality. It's like a shimmery mirror, and here's reality on one side, and then here's what you read, and then there's this intermediating force. But in the defense of the media, one thing that is true is that consumer applications are tangible and used by hundreds of millions of people. And so there is what people are familiar with, what they perceive as technology is that which they can touch and feel and actually use on a daily basis. The iPads and iPhones and Gmails and Dropboxes and Twitters and things of that nature. So thus, what they see is usually consumery and fluffy. Now, once in a while, there will be something
By the way, but my point, I'm not objecting to the media covering it that way. What I'm objecting to is the second-order articles, which then assume, because that's what the media coverage is, that's actually what's happening.
Right. So my counter-argument as to why I think that is going to change pretty soon is kind of threefold. First is a lot of those things that were thought of as fluffy are actually suddenly becoming very impactful. For example, even as like 12 months ago, even 18 months ago, people were calling Bitcoin an imaginary currency for crazy people on the internet. And now Goldman Sachs is saying it can save people $200 billion. So that's an enormous U-turn in like 12 months. So number one, these things that people think are fluffy are actually becoming real. Number two is there's a lot more physically tangible things like self-driving cars or delivery drones where whatever else you can say about them, you cannot say they are like trivial advances or that they will not be earth-shattering. And number three, I think, which is the least appreciated aspect of this is we are, when we talk about consumer products, I think a distinction, which I notice in some of the discussions I've had with people on Twitter, is the consumer producer distinction is going away. That is to say, that was a very 20th century model where you had a big business and it would sell things and there would be consumers who would be passively consuming it. But now you've got a developer who is neither really a producer nor a consumer. They're building something for themselves, right? And as software eats the world and hitting keys on the keyboard is a way to generate things of value for yourself, then people, many more millions of people start to appreciate those, quote, enterprise products as they would use them to build things for themselves, right? So that will never be the majority of people, but it'll be a larger and larger fraction of people. And I think that will also change the conversation over time.
Yeah, I mean, you could turn that the other way around and say that, part of what you're seeing is that kind of the froth and triviality of popular culture that used to be, songs or pranks or movies or fashions is also now being manifested in dating apps or photo sharing apps or kinds of, silly random things. People in their early 20s quite often do things that are unserious.
Yeah.
And if they're coders, they're doing code that's kind of unserious.
Right. Yeah, good point. I think also, like, in regards to sort of producer-consumer distinction collapsing, I think one thing that I realized the other day is there's almost no Hollywood movies that I can think of, at least, that are educational movies. That is meant to train you, to level you up, to add a skill for you, right? And there are some TV kinds.
Well,
of
they would educational, I guess, in that narrow sense. I mean,
in that narrow sense, but here,
Hollywood movie makers would argue they're educating your emotional side.
Yeah, exactly. They're telling a fable or something like that, right? But the reason I bring up that specific point is I think sort of one model for media, which people do complain about, is sort of the page-driven model, which is based on an attention economy, and it's a headline, and if it bleeds, it leads, that kind of thing, and you're basically monetizing on just pure volume. It's the Huffington Post model, the page view model. But there's another model which is not monetizing a very large mass, but it's monetizing those people who actually really need to understand and comprehend the article, right? This is a production versus a consumption model. And so here, for example, you could imagine a site which is not necessarily about news. It wasn't about the newest thing always, but it was, for example, a site that, say, maintained an up-to-date thing, sort of like a Wikipedia, but better maintained on, say, 3D printing. It had all the companies there and so on, almost like an investment research report. And your goal in viewing this was to make an investment decision, to join a company, to download some programs, to start something, to build something, right? And in reading the second one, you did not care about the headline because reading the headline alone was not enough to do something. So the real question is, what are people looking at this media with intent to do? We have a different perspective on it because we have intent to do something, namely make an investment or start a company. People who are just consuming the media to be entertained do not have that incentive to actually understand it more deeply. So I'd say that the latter kind of media where you consume it with intent to reproduce or intent to perform or intent to produce, I think is going to be more important, and it's a different monetization model for media as well.
I would also add that I think just my experience is that more and more entrepreneurs are doing. It's actually the trend is actually quite the opposite of the media's impression, which is I think we've entered into a period of significant gravitas in the technology world in the sense that we just announced our investment in Alt School, for example, which is an attempt to rethink K through 12 education. You have Tesla reinventing the car, SpaceX, all the Elon Musk stuff. Uber and Lyft in transportation, Airbnb in hospitality. Like sort of you go through every major segment of the economy, and you now have for the first time Silicon Valley style companies trying to rethink how the traditional industries have worked. We're seeing, as you know, Balaji, you're doing a lot of it for us, a ton of interesting stuff in healthcare.
Yeah.
I think we have a bunch of investments we've made that we haven't announced yet, but that people will see soon. We've made, 10 investments in healthcare recently or something.
Yes.
And some very, very serious stuff with, like experienced scientists trying to solve big problems. So I feel like it's the opposite trend is true.
I think there's also like a gear change that's happening in technology now where social networks and games and the kind of fun stuff will always be there. But we do have a gear change where it is moving into drones and Bitcoin and genomics and 3D printing and all the stuff that is very important. I think another thing is that Benedict can probably comment on this. Just like by installing all these mobile computers around the world, right? Mobile massively increased the size of the software industry, like sort of horizontally in terms of the number of terminals, and now we're increasing in a different direction, which is sort of the number of verticals that we're going into, right? So the size of what software is going to disrupt is just increased tremendously over the last 5 years.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you made a reference to Newton earlier, and the famous Newton quote is that if I've seen far, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yes.
And a lot of what we're seeing now is the benefit of the last 10 or 15 years of hard work. That a 22-year-old now can go out and build a startup and get millions of users with very little money very quickly, which was impossible 15 years ago.
Yes.
You see WhatsApp was sending the same volume of messages as are sent in the global SMS system.
Right.
And they were doing with that with 24 engineers.
Yeah, 55 people and I'm not sure how many engineers, but probably.
Yeah, half of those were engineers, and they'd raised, they got halfway there on like $6 million.
Yeah.
And you see that in healthcare, you see it in all of the kind of things that we're talking about, is the ability to create really significant and profound businesses on the top of platforms that have been built and achievements that have been created over the last 10 or 15 years. Mm-hmm. And part of that is around things like open source software. It's around the collapse in the cost of data centers, which is what makes Twitter and Facebook possible, among other things. Mm-hmm. Part of it is the explosion in mobile devices. So there are, as it might be, 1.5 billion PCs on Earth now, maybe more, maybe less. It kind of depends on whose guesses you believe. And half of those are corporate and locked down, and half of those are consumer and immobile and kind of stay at home and are shared. And we will go to 3 to 3.5 billion smartphones on Earth. And those are mobile and personal and taken everywhere.
And now you see Android Wear that just came out yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so you have proliferation and indeed kind of innovation within that. So one of the puzzles in mobile is that although the sort of the Android Apple platform war is over and they both won, nothing's actually settled in terms of what happens on top of those devices or what other devices there might be. There's still kind of massive change in innovation going on top of that. But all of that comes in the context of this enormous scale. So, a 22-year-old can create a cool dating app and get 10 million users and benchmark it for himself. I mean, this is the most extreme example of this is probably Imgur, where they got God knows how many hundreds of millions of users with one person.
Right.
And $7.
And $7.
Right.
And, you see that with WhatsApp. You see it with all of the people who are now taking all of the ARM and all of the chipsets that have been created for the smartphone business, and that's now enabling the drone industry and enabling a whole bunch of other interesting types of hardware. So it's like
the satellite companies we're seeing, they're all reconfigured cell
exactly. So it's like there was the nuclear winter after the last crash, and then for the last 10 years, people have been building and slogging away and creating platforms and creating lots of hardcore technology.
It's the opposite of technical debt. It's sort of technical savings, and we've built up so much of it over the last 10 years.
And now you're getting this kind of flowering of new things that can be built on that. And you see that in really trivial things, but you also see it in Tesla and $100 satellites.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one way of thinking about that is like, no one is going to say buy a computer just to use Twitter. But once they bought the computer, there's an incremental zero cost of experimenting with Twitter and so on, right? So like installing that platform, there has to be that killer app for it. Like for a mobile phone, it's texting and it's visual voicemail and it's all the things that the iPhone push people over that threshold. But then after that, it's just this deployment point where you can build billion-dollar companies on top of that install base. So I think a very interesting strategic question, just from an investment standpoint, is what kinds of platforms are there that are like that? Like what kinds of platforms cure such a pain point that then once we get people in it, then we can deploy lots more stuff on that. I think one of those things is probably going to be Bitcoin, like getting lots of people Bitcoin wallets, because you can deploy all kinds of software on top of that once they have Bitcoin wallets. So.